Barry Khan is 4 minutes.
Thank you very much, Lashkan Corley, and I welcome the opportunity that is given in allowing this topical issue to be taken and used as a means to update the Government and indeed the House in relation to what was termed by the CEO of Bord na Móna last October the acceleration of decarbonisation. The acceleration has now turned into a speed wobble. There is ongoing and continued bog closures and rising bog closures. There was to have been 17 in the initial announcement. Last week there was a further 4 added to that list. There is ongoing redundancies and rising redundancies. At the time of the announcement we were told it would be in the region of 400. It's now at 600 plus. There's an ongoing and rising impact not only on the communities and the locality, but now a real threat to the ongoing future of the co-fuelling plants at Shannonbridge, at Lough Ree and at Edenderry. And meanwhile, while all this is taking place, there is no correlation between the income generated from the existing carbon tax, let alone a multiple of 4 that has been talked about, to my county of Offaly and the Midlands region, which is suffering greatest in relation to that decarbonisation programme. It is, and allied to that, no application to the EU Globalisation Fund, which was promised. Allied to that, no application by the Irish Government in relation to the coal regions in transition fund that was set up last year, at which the Irish Government made no application. And it took myself and a local councillor in Offaly, Eamon Daly, on a visit to the EU Commission to find that out. And now I find out last week, when the Just Transition Forum, which we had sought and we were glad was set up with the approval of Government, but it lacks a bit of teeth and a bit of money in order for it to do the work that we think it can do. Notwithstanding its combined efforts, which we recognise and appreciate in relation to the upskilling and the matching of skills and the help and assistance being given by relevant departments and by training funds such as the ETB and AIT, and indeed local reps who have an input into that process too. But what I am most disappointed to learn last week is that there have been discussions ongoing between Bord na Móna and the relevant department within Government in relation to this issue of subvention of biomass. I was assured, further to the announcement, at an Oireachtas committee meeting by the CEO of Bord na Móna, that despite the obvious glaring difficulties that may arise in relation to the pricing mechanism post-CSO with ESB and the issue in relation to biomass, and there being no incentive for growers in Ireland, let alone the contracts associated with the importation that there is taking place from South Africa and elsewhere. And the CEO assured me that no, that they had put into their costings those variables and were happy and content and could make a commitment to me and others that co-fuelling would continue. But alas, I am to learn, as I said last week when I inquired as to the reason for the 4 bog closures, they were feeder bogs for co-fuelling at the 3 plants that I mentioned. And that not only affects and will materialise in those 50 jobs associated with those bogs being lost, but that now creates a real and obvious threat to the power plants themselves, and the huge impact, of course, and the knock-on effect that has in communities. Minister, the CEO said at Bord na Móna said at the time of the announcement that the staff in Bord na Móna, they get it, they get the programme, they get the need for decarbonisation, and the communities in Offaly and beyond too recognise the need for transition. But they had hoped and would appreciate if it were what we termed a just transition. But in order for it to be a just transition, Government must match that effort and commitment with funding and with real opportunities for alternative forms of employment to be found. And unfortunately that is lacking, and it is seriously lacking to date. And I know that the line minister who can't be here today, and I accept that, and he will respond in writing in more detail next week, and I appreciate your own efforts in relation to it. But I would have thought that far from waiting on a 6-month report from the Just Transition Forum, that his own members of his own party and his own government, let alone not listening to me, but he would listen to them and see that this is having a severe impact. It has potentially a huge impact akin to the government sitting on its hands, akin to the government turning out the lights in Offaly and the Midlands and allowing it to drift. And the carbon tax, as I have said, it's Fianna Fáil policy, and I would hope that it will be the policy of this government and any incoming government to allow for the ring fencing of funds within the revenue generated by carbon tax to be immediately directed and targeted at areas such as ours that is feeling the impact of the transition.
4 minutes.
Can I thank Deputy Cowen for raising this issue, and I'm pleased to take the issue on behalf of Minister Bruton and to relay your comments and your concerns that you're raising here on the floor of the Dáil. I will relay back to Minister Bruton, and as you said, you accept his apologies that he's physically not in the House at this moment in time and unable to take it, but that he will come back to you with further in writing next week, and I know you've already raised some of these issues with him. As set out in the National Development Plan, the Government intends that by 2030 peat and coal will no longer have a role in electricity generation in Ireland. This is in line with Ireland's commitments under the Paris Agreement and the national policy position, which sets out a long-term vision of an aggregate reduction in carbon dioxide emissions of at least 80% compared to 1990 levels by 2050 across the electricity generation, built environment and transport sectors. The 3 electricity generating plants in the Midlands have a total generating capacity of 378 megawatts. Edenderry is a 128 megawatt plant owned and operated by Bord na Móna and is fuelled with a mix of peat and biomass. Under the Department's Refit 3 support scheme, it has support for co-firing with up to 30% biomass up to 2030. Edenderry has planning permission to co-fire with biomass up to 2023. It is Bord na Móna's intention to operate the plant fully on biomass by 2028 if planning permission beyond 2023 is received. Lough Ree, a 100 megawatt plant, and West Offaly, a 150 megawatt plant, are both owned and operated by ESB. At present, both have support under the public service obligation to fuel with peat, but this support ends in December this year. Both plants have been granted support under Refit 3 for the co-firing with up to 30% biomass up to 2030. ESB is in the process of seeking planning permission to co-fire with biomass in both Lough Ree and West Offaly. The ESB is fully committed to this process as part of its strategy to lead decarbonisation in Ireland. As part of this strategy, it is anticipated that both plants will co-fire peat and biomass as soon as planning is obtained, with the intention of using only biomass by 2027. Decisions on these applications are likely to be made in the later stages of 2019. An oral hearing has been scheduled for the 16th of April in relation to the West Offaly plant. Bord na Móna has outlined to the Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment a revised plan for reducing the amount of peat in the 3 plants up to 2028 and replacing with biomass. As the rate of biomass co-firing increases, the total biomass requirement in 2029 is expected to be about 2.6 million tonnes. This transition from peat to biomass will increase the amount of renewable electricity on the system and reduce overall GHG emissions relative to the plants continuing to run with support of 30% biomass. This is based on a number of assumptions, for example, that all 3 plants receive planning permission to co-fire peat with biomass up to 2027 or 2028, that all 3 plants secure additional support to produce additional renewable electricity from biomass, and by the mid-2020s additional quantities of indigenous biomass are available. If this plan is implemented, Bord na Móna would complete the transition out of peat production for electricity generation by December 2028, which is 2 years ahead of the original commitment under its 2016 Sustainability 2030 policy to cease use of peat in electricity generation by 2030. One of the recommendations of the All-Party Joint Committee on Climate Action in its recent report is that the Government re-evaluate its co-firing subsidy for peat and biomass given environmental concerns identified by the Climate Change Advisory Council, and that Bord na Móna and DSB should re-evaluate their future plans for biomass due to the lack of an indigenous supply. As I mentioned earlier, the support for the use of peat in electricity generation for DSB plants ends this year. The support for Edenderry ended in 2015. All 3 plants referred to have support for up to 30% biomass to 2030. The Department of Communications, Climate Action and Environment is examining the recommendations of the Joint Committee. In the context of just transition, where no region will be left behind in the transition to a low-carbon economy, Minister Bruton has recently written to the European Commission requesting the inclusion of the Midlands region and the coal regions in transition platform. The main objectives of the platform are to enable multi-stakeholder dialogue on policy frameworks for successful transformation of carbon-intensive regions and to facilitate the development of strategies and projects in areas such as investment for structural transformation, growth and jobs.
2 minutes, Deputy Cowen.
Thank you, Minister, for the response. And I know and appreciate you can't get into the belly of a lot of what I had to say, and I would expect, as indicated, that the Minister would respond more appropriately to what I've just said in my opening submission. In relation to the detail contained within the response that you have, I think it's pertinent for me to say that the Edenderry power plant permission that was granted after much deliberation by the courts, is a blueprint and is a precedent by which I expect that the other two applications will be successful for co-fuelling. The point I wish to seek clarification on, and I would hope that the government and its representatives would respond as soon as is practically possible, is that there is a commitment to co-fuel with biomass up to 2028, when biomass itself takes over exclusively thereafter. That would indicate that harvesting could continue to 2026, we'd say, that the stocks would be sufficient thereafter. But as I said to you, and as I only became aware and was made aware last week at the tail end of a Just Transition Forum meeting, that 4 bogs have been suspended, and they are the feeder bogs for the 3 power plants that we mentioned. So that would seem to indicate that their discussions with yourselves, or the department responsible, are not likely to yield the result that they would have hoped, which in turn, as I said, threatens the viability of the plants themselves, which threatens the viability of the jobs within the plant, which threatens the viability of the communities in which they serve. And that's something that I would expect should be forthcoming to me as soon as is possible. I would hope next week that I want to know what detail was contained within those discussions and what has resulted from those discussions, and what now is government policy if it contradicts what was there previously, let alone the wide-ranging issues surrounding the greater effect and impact Minister. Of the ongoing decarbonisation, as I said, gone from acceleration to a speed wobble with an almighty crash waiting to happen, and those that suffer are my constituents,
Ministers,
not those from many other parts of the country.
Thank you again, Lieutenant Corlin. Thank you, Deputy, and thank you for your understanding that I can't be on top of the brief, and neither can I make policy statements in this area, and I appreciate you being so cooperative on that basis. I have a prepared concluding script, but it doesn't address what you're asking me there specifically, so I leave that to the record of the House. But I will ensure that the Minister does come back to you, and I note your timeline and your wish for that timeline to have the details of those discussions and what steps are being taken, particularly with on the issue of the bogs that you raised. I'll ensure that the Minister is aware of your request to have that information next week if possible, and I'll convey that to the Minister for you.
Thank you.